The wax under my fingers was warm. Not from my hands, not from the lamp I worked beneath, but warm from somewhere I could not name. 3 hours after I had pressed it against the face of a boy who had been dead for 13 years. I held the mold of Carlo Acutis in my palms in that workshop in Assisi, and the wax pulsed with a heat that no material in my craft should hold. I told no one. For 6 years, I told no one what my fingers found beneath that mask. My name is Tommaso Reggiani. I have been a sculptor and a mold maker for 34 years. I have cast the faces of cardinals, the hands of the dead, the death masks of men whose names fill the marble of churches across Italy. More than 200 funerary casts have passed through my hands, and I learned long ago that a face in death tells no lies. I did not believe in the supernatural. I believed in temperature, in the setting time of silicone, in the weight of plaster, and the honest cold of a body that has stopped. But there are three things I have never been able to explain. The first is what I felt when I touched the inside of that silicone mold, in the hollow where his cheek had been. A warmth that should not have existed, and that did not fade for hours. The second is what the technician from Milan measured with his instrument 2 days later, a reading he refused to sign his name to. And the third is what was sealed inside the small envelope Antonia Salzano placed in my hand the morning I finished, with the single instruction that I was not to open it until I understood why. For 6 years I stayed silent. Today, I tell it all. I came to this work the way most men come to it, by accident and by hunger. I trained as a restorer of church statuary in Florence, learned to repair the broken fingers of saints, and discovered I had a gift for the human face. By 30, I was making casts for families who wanted to hold something of the people they had lost. It is grim work to most. To me, it was tender. I am not a religious man, or I was not. I went to Mass at Christmas to please my mother, and the rest of the year I worked with my hands and asked nothing of heaven. I live alone above my workshop, with a dog named Bruno who sleeps under the bench while I work. In the spring of the year they prepared to display Carlo Acutis in Assisi, I received a telephone call I did not expect. The voice was a man from the diocese, careful and quiet. They were preparing the tomb in the church of Santa Maria Maggiore. The body of the young man had been exhumed and examined, and the decision had been made to present him to the faithful with his features restored, dressed simply, in jeans and trainers, the way he had lived. For this, they needed a face. Not the bone, not what time had done, but a likeness, a silicone covering modeled with exactness over the true contours, so that the boy the pilgrims came to see would look like the boy who had lived. They needed a craftsman who could work with reverence and discretion. My name had been given to them. I said yes before I understood what I was agreeing to. 3 days later, I drove from Florence to Assisi with my cases in the boot of my car, the silicone in sealed tubs, the fine plaster, the calipers, the small soft brushes I use for the delicate places around the eyes. The hills were green, and the light was the gold that Assisi keeps for itself. I remember thinking it was an ordinary commission. A face is a face. I had done hundreds. They brought me to a room beneath the basilica that they had prepared, cool and clean, with strong lamps and a steel table. The remains had already been treated by the team responsible for the exhumation and conservation. My work was the surface, the visible truth that the world would see through the glass. I was introduced to a woman with calm, dark eyes, and a stillness about her that I have never forgotten. She was the mother, Antonia Salzano. She shook my hand and held it a moment longer than people do, and she said only, "You will treat him gently." And I said I would. I set my instruments out in their order. I measured the room. 18 degrees Celsius, the thermometer on the wall said, and the air was dry and still. I checked my silicone against the chart on the lid, the working temperature, the setting time, the precise ratio of base to catalyst that I had measured 1,000 times. Everything was as it should be. It was when I leaned over to begin, when I brought my fingertips to the cheek to feel the contour I would need to honor, that the first thing happened that I could not file away. The skin was not the temperature of the room. I want to be exact, because exactness is the only honesty I have. A body that has been preserved and kept in a cool room takes the temperature of that room. It should have been 18 degrees, give or take a degree. Cool to the touch. The cool I have felt under my fingers more times than I can count. I have a calibrated infrared thermometer that I use to check surfaces before I cast, because silicone behaves differently against a cold face than a warm one, and an error of a few degrees can ruin a mold. I lifted it from my case, and I aimed it at the cheek, and I pressed the trigger. 26.4 degrees Celsius. I lowered the instrument, and I looked at it for a long time. Then I aimed it at the steel table beside the body. 18.1. I aimed it at my own hand. 34. I aimed it back at the cheek. 26.4 again, exactly, as though the number had been waiting for me. Antonia Salzano was watching me from the corner of the room. I did not say anything to her. I told myself the instrument had drifted, that the cold storage had been warmer than I assumed, that there was a lamp too close. I moved the lamps away. I waited 20 minutes and measured again. 26.1. It had barely moved. The table had cooled to 17.8 in that same time, because I had moved the lamp, but the face had held its warmth, as though something inside it were generating heat. I did not understand it. So I did what I always do when I do not understand. I worked. Before I began to lay the silicone, Antonia came to the table. She had a small envelope in her hand, cream-colored, the flap sealed with a bead of wax. She placed it on the tray beside my brushes. She told me her son had asked her, in the last days, to give a sealed letter to the person who would one day make his face. I thought she had misheard her own son and his fever, or that grief had arranged a memory into a shape that comforted her. A boy of 15 does not foresee a sculptor. I almost said this. I did not. I looked at the envelope, and I saw that across the front, in a careful young hand, were written 4 words. To the one who touches what is beneath. I asked her when I should open it. She said, not yet. She said, you will know. And she said, when you understand why your hands are warm, then you may open it, and not before. I put the envelope in the inner pocket of my work jacket, the one over my chest, and I told myself I would forget it. I did not forget it. For 6 years it stayed with me, and there were nights I took it out and held it to the lamp and could see nothing through the cream paper, and I put it back unopened because a craftsman keeps his word, and because, if I am honest, I was afraid. I turned back to the table, and the warmth was still there, under my fingers, where nothing should have been warm. I began the way I always begin, with a thin barrier coat brushed into the fine places, the corners of the eyes, the curve of the nostril, the line of the lips, so the detail would carry. The silicone I use sets by chemistry, not by temperature, but heat speeds it, and a warm surface gives me less time. On a cold face, I have 11, 12 minutes of working time. I expected those minutes. I did not get them. The silicone began to skin in under 7, as though it were curing against a body that still had a fever, and I had to work faster than I have ever worked, my hands flying, my breath held, while behind me, Antonia Salzano stood without a sound. When the first layer set, I touched it through my glove, and it was warm. Silicone holds little heat of its own. It should have cooled to the room. It did not. I peeled the edge to check the bond, and underneath, against the skin, the surface was warmer still. I told myself it was the exothermic reaction of the curing, the small heat that catalyzed silicone gives off as it sets. I know that heat. I have felt it 1,000 times through a glove. It is faint, it rises for a minute, and it fades. This did not fade. I laid my second coat, and the heat under it grew, and by the time I built the rigid plaster mother mold over the silicone to hold its shape, the whole assembly in my hands was the temperature of something alive. I finished the outer shell, and I stepped back, and I pulled off my gloves, and I held my bare hands a few centimeters from the mold, the way you hold your hands to a stove to feel if it is on. The heat came up against my palms. From a mold of plaster and silicone, in a room at 18 degrees, 3 hours after I had begun, over the face of a boy 13 years dead. That was the moment I understood I was not going to be able to explain this with my instruments. And that is when the problem stopped being a problem of temperature and became something I had no word for. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the small guest room the diocese had arranged near the basilica, and I went over every variable a rational man can hold: storage temperature, lamp proximity, instrument drift, the exothermic curing of the silicone. Each one I had checked. Each one had failed to account for what I had measured. A preserved body does not generate heat. It cannot. Heat in a body comes from metabolism, from the burning of fuel in living cells. And there was no fuel, and there were no living cells. And yet the number on my instrument had been 26.4, 26.1, holding, while every cold thing around it obeyed the room. In the morning, I went back down before anyone else, to test it alone, with no one watching, because part of me hoped that in the night it would have stopped and I could go home and forget it. I let myself into the cool room, and I switched on a single lamp, and I lifted my thermometer and I aimed it at the demolded face, the true surface now uncovered, the silicone shell set aside on its stand. 25.9 degrees Celsius, 14 hours after I had first touched him. I checked my instrument against the steel table, 17.6, cold and honest. I checked it against the wall, against my own wrist, against the cup of coffee I had carried down, and every reading was exactly what it should be: the world behaving, physics intact, except for the one place where it was not. I did something then that I am not proud of, and that I have never told the diocese. I had a second thermometer in my case, a contact probe, the kind with a thin metal tip you press to a surface, made by a different manufacturer, calibrated by a laboratory in Milan 2 months before. I did not trust the infrared anymore. I wanted metal against the surface, a different physics, a different machine. I pressed the probe to the cheek, in the hollow where my fingers had first found the warmth, and I watched the digits climb and settle. 25.7 degrees Celsius. 2 instruments, 2 principles of measurement, the same impossible number. And now the problem was worse than it had been the night before, because as long as it was 1 instrument, I could call it broken, and now it was 2, and I could not. I sat down on the steel stool in that cold room, and I held my own face in my hands, and I felt the warmth of my living skin under my fingers, the warmth that comes from blood and breath, the warmth I had felt under the fingers of every living person I have ever touched. And it was the same warmth I had felt under the fingers of Carlo Acutis, exactly the same, as though somewhere beneath the surface, a heart I could not hear was still keeping its temperature against the cold. I needed someone who was not me. I needed an instrument I had not chosen, and a man who had no reason to lie. So I telephoned a thermographic technician I had worked with years before, a man named Ferretti, who measured heat in church frescoes for conservation, who carried a thermal imaging camera worth more than my car, and who believed in nothing he could not photograph. I told him I had an anomalous surface I needed mapped, and I did not tell him whose face it was. He drove down from Milan that afternoon. Ferretti set up his camera, a professional thermal imager that renders heat as color, cold in blue and warm in red, accurate to 1/10 of a degree. He pointed it at the room first to calibrate, and the room bloomed blue and gray, cold and even, the steel table a darker blue, my body a column of orange. Then he turned it toward the face on the stand. I watched the screen over his shoulder. The face came up red, warm against the blue room, glowing like a face that had just come in from the sun, the heat strongest in the cheeks and the brow, fading at the edges, the way warmth fades on living skin. Ferretti said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "Your storage is too warm." And he went to the wall and read the thermometer there, 18 degrees. And he came back and looked at the screen. and the face was 25.8 in the camera's reading, and the table beside it was 17.9, and the same air touched them both. He measured it 4 ways over the next hour. He moved the camera, he recalibrated against a reference plate of known temperature, he checked the lens for thermal smear. Each time, the face came up warm, and the table came up cold, and there was nothing between them to explain it. No lamp, no current, no source. The last time he lowered the camera, he was not the same man who had set it up. He asked me whose face it was. I told him. He packed his camera without a word. At the door, he turned and said he would send me the thermal images, the raw files, but that he would not put his name on a report, and that I should not say I had spoken to him. He said, "I measure heat in dead frescoes, and dead things obey the room, and this one does not, and I do not want to be the man who wrote that down." Then he drove back to Milan, and I never heard from him again. The files came 2 days later from an address with no name. I have them still. If something of this story has reached into you the way that warmth reached into my hands, I want to give you something before I go further. I prepared a novena to Carlo Acutis, completely free, so that you can bring to him whatever it is you carry, the name you whisper at night, the person you cannot heal yourself. It is in the description, the first link right below this video. Download it and pray it over 9 days, in your own time, in your own kitchen. But before I tell you what the technician's images revealed when I studied them alone that night, I have to go back to the envelope over my chest, and to the question Antonia Salzano had set before me like a key I was not yet allowed to turn. That night, I opened the thermal files on my laptop in the guest room, and what I saw made the warmth in my hands seem almost simple by comparison. Ferretti's camera had recorded not just temperature, but its pattern, the distribution of heat across the surface, frame by frame, the way a film holds motion. And when I scrubbed slowly through the frames, I saw something that no setting of a thermal imager and no warmth of storage could produce. The heat on the face was not even. It was not the dull, uniform warmth of an object that has simply absorbed energy from somewhere. It moved. Across 40 minutes of recording, the warm regions shifted, faintly, the way warmth shifts on a sleeping face as the blood beneath it stirs, a slow pulse of warmth rising in the cheek and ebbing and rising again, with a rhythm. I counted it, frame by frame, with the timestamps Ferretti's camera had stamped on each image. I measured the interval between the swells of warmth. The pattern repeated roughly every 83 seconds. Not a heartbeat, far too slow for that, but not random either. A rhythm in the heat of a face that should have had no rhythm at all, because it should have had no source, because it should have been the temperature of the room. I did not sleep again. I told myself a camera can produce artifacts, drifting noise that the eye assembles into pattern. So in the morning, I went down and I did the most primitive test there is, the one no instrument can fake. I laid my own bare palm against the cheek, and I closed my eyes, and I held it there, and I counted my own breaths. And under my palm, faint but unmistakable, the warmth swelled and faded, swelled and faded, against the skin, on a slow tide, exactly as the camera had shown. I was feeling it now with the oldest instrument a man has, my own hand, and it was real. It was then that another witness entered this, because I was not the only one in that room anymore. A woman from the conservation team had come down to check the seals on the storage case, a careful, exhausted woman named Sister Lucia, who had worked on the preservation since the exhumation, and who believed, I think, in everything I did not. She saw me standing with my palm on the boy's cheek and my eyes shut, and she did not laugh at me, and she did not call me mad. She asked me, quietly, what I felt, and I, who had told no one, told her. The warmth, the rhythm, the number that would not fall. She did not seem surprised. She went to a steel cabinet at the side of the room, and she took out a folder, and from the folder, a single page, the conservation log, the record kept of the body's temperature at intervals since the exhumation, the readings the team took with their own probe to monitor the preservation. She put it in front of me, and she pointed with one finger down the column of numbers. Every reading, week after week, month after month, in a room held at a constant low temperature for conservation, was the same. Between 25 and 27 degrees Celsius for the entire period of the record. The body had never taken the temperature of its room, not once. The team had assumed an error in their own probe at first, she said, and had replaced it twice, and the readings had not changed. They had stopped writing about it in the reports. They had simply kept measuring, and the numbers kept coming, warm and steady and impossible, and no one wanted to be the one to say it aloud. So now there were not 2 instruments, there were 5. My infrared, my contact probe, Ferretti's thermal camera, the team's conservation probe, and my own bare hand. 5 independent measurements over months by people who had never met, who had no reason to agree, and every one of them said the same thing, that the face of Carlo Acutis held a living warmth in a cold room, with a slow rhythm in it, for no reason that any of us could put a name to. And the worst of it, the thing that turned the back of my neck cold, even as my palms stayed warm, was this. If the warmth had a rhythm, then it had something it was answering. A rhythm is a response. A pulse keeps time with something. And whatever the warmth in that face was keeping time with, I could not see it and I could not hear it. And it had been keeping time for years in the dark of a sealed case where no one was watching. Sister Lucia put the log back in its folder. Before she closed the cabinet, she said one thing that I have carried since. She said, "You are not the first to feel it, but you are the first he asked for by name." And she looked at my chest, at the place where the envelope was, as though she knew it was there. And she said nothing more, and she left me alone in the cold room with the warm face and the rhythm I could not explain. I did not open the envelope. I was not ready. But I began that day to want to know who this boy had been, because I had treated him as a surface, a contour, a commission, and I was beginning to understand that I had been touching something I had no instrument for at all. In the days that followed, I finished the work I had been brought to do. I cast the final silicone face, the one the world would see through the glass, and I matched it to the contours my calipers had given me, the breadth of the brow, the set of the cheekbones, the gentle line of a mouth that even in death held something that was almost ease. And as I worked, I asked the people around the basilica about him, the boy, Carlo, and a picture came together piece by piece that did not match the warmth at all, and yet somehow explained it. He had been 15. He had loved computers, the way every boy his age loved them, but he had done something with that love that no one had asked of him. He had built a website with his own hands, in his own bedroom, a teenager in Milan. He had spent years cataloging the Eucharistic miracles of the world, the cases the Church had documented over centuries, where the consecrated host was said to have become flesh, to have bled, to have refused to corrupt. More than 130 of them, gathered, photographed, described, mapped country by country, so that anyone in the world with a connection could see them. They called him, in the years after, the patron of the internet, God's influencer, the first saint of his generation, a boy who had died in 2006 with a mobile phone and a love for the Eucharist that he called, in his own words, his highway to heaven. That phrase stopped me when I first heard it, his highway to heaven, because I had spent my life making the faces of the dead, and I had never once felt that any of them had gone anywhere. They went cold, and they went still, and they went into the ground, and that was the only highway I had ever seen. But this boy had built a record of the moment when bread was said to become flesh, the moment when dead matter was said to hold life. And now his own dead face held a warmth that behaved like life, and I did not think that was an accident anymore. I asked to speak with his mother again before I left. Antonia Salzano received me in a small room with 2 chairs and a window onto the green hills. I told her what I had measured: the warmth, the rhythm, the 5 instruments. I expected her to weep or to seize on it as a sign. She did neither. She listened with that stillness of hers, and when I finished, she said something that closed one door in my mind and opened a far larger one. She said that in the last days of his illness, when the leukemia had moved through him faster than the doctors could follow, Carlo had spoken about his hands being warm. He had said it to her more than once. He had said, "Mama, my hands are so warm." And the doctors found nothing, no fever that explained it, and he had smiled about it, as though it were a private thing he understood and they did not. And then, she said, near the very end, he had told her something that she had written down because she did not want to lose it. He had said that one day a man would come to make his face, and that the man would not believe, and that the man's own hands would grow warm when he touched what was beneath, and that this would be how the man would begin to believe. I sat very still. I had not given my name to anyone in the family until the day I arrived. I had been chosen weeks earlier by a diocesan committee that Antonia had not sat on. And here was a boy who had died in 2006, when I was still casting cardinals in Florence and believing in nothing, who had told his mother that a man who did not believe would come, and that his hands would grow warm. I asked her the date. She found the page in a small worn notebook. The 8th of October, 2006, 4 days before he died. San Gerardo Hospital in Monza. And beside the words she had written that day was a line I have never forgotten: that he had said the man would understand fully not in Assisi, but in a hospital, in another October, far from there, when his own life was the thing in the balance. A date, a place, and a prediction reaching forward into an October that had not yet come. I had the envelope still, over my chest, with its 4 words, "To the one who touches what is beneath," and I understood now that I was the one. But I did not open it, because Antonia had said I would open it when I understood why my hands were warm, and I did not understand it yet. I only knew that it was true, and there is a difference between knowing a thing is true and understanding why. I drove back to Florence with the envelope unopened, and the warmth still alive in the memory of my hands, and I told no one, and the years began to pass. If you have come this far with me, you already feel what I felt, and if you downloaded that novena I spoke of, you have somewhere to put it. If you have not yet, it is still there, the first link in the description, free, for whoever needs it most, for the name you are carrying right now as you listen. This is where I keep gathering these stories, the traces this boy left in places he never went. But I have to tell you what happened 5 years later, in an October I did not see coming, because that is when the envelope finally taught me what it had been waiting to say. For 5 years, I lived as I had always lived. I worked. I cast the faces of the dead with the same care as before, but I confess that I touched each of them now with a question in my fingertips, a hope I would not say aloud, and not one of them was ever warm. They were cold and honest, every one, the way bodies are. The warmth had belonged to one face only, and I began to think I had been given a single glimpse of something, and would never be given another, and that perhaps that was mercy enough for a man like me. Then, in the autumn of the 5th year, I grew ill. It came the way these things come, quietly and then all at once. A tiredness I blamed on age, a bruising I could not explain. And then a morning when I could not rise from my bed, and Bruno stood at the door, barking until a neighbor came, and an ambulance, and a hospital, and a word I had heard before in connection with a boy I had never met: leukemia. The same family of illness, the doctor said, that had taken the young man in Monza, though mine was the slower kind, and his had been the fulminant kind that kills in days. Still, when the doctor said the word, I lay in the bed, and I felt the floor of my life tilt, because I knew, the way you know a thing in your body before your mind permits it, that I had arrived at the October Carlo had spoken of. They could not treat me where I was. The specialist unit was in another city, and they moved me by ambulance through a long gray afternoon, and I did not ask where until we arrived, and they wheeled me through the doors, and I saw the name above them. I will not pretend it was Monza, because it was not, and I have promised you only the truth. It was a regional hospital, 2 hours from Florence, whose name I had never had reason to learn. But Antonia's notebook had not said Monza for me. It had said another hospital, in another October, far from Assisi, where my own life would be the thing in the balance. And here I was, in October, in a hospital, with my life in the balance, exactly as a boy had told his mother 5 years before he ever heard my name. The envelope was in the drawer of my bedside table at home. I had brought almost nothing with me, but I had asked the neighbor who fed Bruno to bring me one thing, the cream-colored envelope from the inner drawer, and she had brought it that evening without asking what it was, and it lay now on the white blanket over my chest, in the same place I had carried it for 5 years, over my heart. I understood, finally, that this was the place, that I had been told I would open it when I understood why my hands were warm, and that I would understand fully in a hospital, in an October, when my own life hung in the balance. All of it had come true around me, like a room assembling itself from the dark. So I broke the bead of wax with my thumb, in a bed in a leukemia ward, with a needle in my arm and a slow drip counting time above me like a rhythm, and I drew out the single folded page inside. It was written in the same careful young hand as the 4 words on the front. It was not long. I have it memorized because I have read it more times than I can count, but I will tell you what it said. It said, "To the one who touches what is beneath, do not be afraid of the warmth in your hands, for it is not yours, and it is not mine. It is his. The same warmth that is in the bread on the altar that the world thinks is only bread." It said, "You will not believe me when you read this. You will be a man who measures things. But you will measure this, and your instruments will fail you. And that is the beginning." And then it said the thing that stopped my heart in that bed. It gave a date. It said, "When you read this, you will be ill, in the autumn, and you must not despair, because the same warmth that is in your hands is in you, and you will not die of this. You will live to tell it, and you will know me then the way I have always wanted to be known, not as a wonder, but as a friend." And below that, a date, written by a boy in October of 2006, the 7th of September of this very year, 5 years on from the day I cast his face. He wrote that on that date, the world would call him a saint, and that I should look for him there, and that this would be the proof that the warmth had never lied. I did not know, lying in that bed, that the date he had written would prove to be the day of his canonization, because no man could have known in 2006 the day a future pope would choose. But I held the page and I wept, the way I had not wept since I was a child, because a boy who had died before I knew his name had written to me across 19 years, had told me my hands would grow warm, had told me I would be ill in an autumn, had told me I would not die, and had given me a date that was still in my future as I read it. And I had measured everything in my life, and here was the one thing I could not measure, lying on my chest, in his hand. I lived. The slow leukemia answered the treatment, the way the fulminant kind had not answered for him, and by the spring I was home, weak and thin and changed, with Bruno asleep under the bench and the envelope in a frame on the wall where I could see it from where I work. And on the 7th of September of that year, the date written on the page, I was well enough to travel, and I went, and I stood in the great square in Rome, among more people than I had ever seen gathered in one place, and I watched as the church declared Carlo Acutis a saint, the first of his generation, they said, the boy with the mobile phone and the website, and the love for the Eucharist that he had called his highway to heaven. And I stood in that crowd, a sculptor who had touched the warmth beneath his face and lived to tell it, holding the date he had written for me 5 years before in the careful hand of a 15-year-old. And I understood at last, fully, why my hands had been warm. They had been warm because the warmth was never about a body. It was about the thing the boy had spent his short life pointing at, the bread that the world thinks is only bread, the presence he had built a website to defend, the highway he had climbed. He had been beatified 5 years before that day, in 2020, after the cure of a Brazilian boy named Matthias. And again, the church had confirmed it with the cure of a young woman named Valeria. And now, in front of the world, they had declared what I had measured with 5 instruments in a cold room and felt with my own bare hand. That something in him was not finished. That something kept its warmth and its rhythm against all the cold of the grave. If this testimony has marked you as deeply as it marked my life, I ask you one thing. Subscribe and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Someone carrying a cold they cannot warm. On this channel, we keep gathering the traces this boy left across the world, in places he never walked, in the hands of people who did not believe. And if you want to carry something of this story with you, the free novena to Carlo Acutis is in the description, the first link below this video. Pray it, share it, keep his memory alive in your own home. Carlo said the Eucharist was his highway to heaven. The traces of heaven are everywhere. You only have to know how to look. I am an old man now, or older than I was, and I still make faces from the clay and the silicone, and they are still cold under my hands, every one, the way the dead are cold. I have only ever touched one warmth that did not belong to this world. I testified to what I measured before a commission in Rome, who wrote it all down, the temperatures and the rhythm and the 5 instruments and the date on the page. And they thanked me, and they kept the record. And whatever they make of it is not mine to decide. But I will tell you what I know in the end, with the only certainty a man who measures things has ever been able to keep. I touched the face of a boy 13 years dead, and it was warm. I told no one for 6 years, because I was afraid and because I did not understand. I understand now. The warmth was a message, and the message was that the cold is not the last thing, that the grave is not the room where the temperature is finally fixed, that there is a fire somewhere beneath the surface of the world that keeps its own rhythm in the dark, whether we are watching or not. A boy knew that at 15. He built his whole short life around it. And then he reached forward through the years to a man who knew nothing of it, and he warmed that man's hands. And he was right about everything. The illness, the autumn, the hospital, the date, all of it, down to the day. I do not say touch his face and you will feel it. I felt it once, and I think it was given to me because I needed it more than the believers did. But I will say this, to you, wherever you are listening. The warmth he wrote of is not only in a sealed case in Assisi. It is on every altar in the world, in the thing the boy spent his life pointing toward. He called it his highway. I called it impossible, and I measured it, and it broke every instrument I owned, and it saved my life. And now, like him, I only know how to point. The traces of heaven are everywhere. You only have to know how to look.